you will be able to ask questions via the Q&A box. So please do put in your questions there as the discussion progresses, so that we will be able to answer some of them at the end of the event. I'm sure you've seen the agenda for today, and we shall try to follow that as much as possible. Let me say a few words about the center which I co-direct before I invite Beatrice Szczepek, who is the head of education, School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London, to give the welcome remarks for the event today and to introduce our speakers. The Center for Education and International Development, which we call CID, was launched in 2017 with myself and my colleague, Professor Len Unterholter, as the co-directors. But the area of work in education and international development goes way back to the formation of the Institute. So the center is nearly over 90 years in terms of the work in this area, which sits very well with the discussion we are having today. Over many years, since around 1927, its name has changed many times. At one point, it was called the Department for Colonial Education. And then later on, it changed to become the Department of Education in Tropical Areas. In 1973, it became the Department of Education in Developing Countries. In 1985, the Department of Education of International and Comparative Education. In 1995, Education and International Development Department. And as I've said, in 2017, we relaunched it as the Center for Education and International Development. You can visit our website, UCL website. You can also visit the Institute of Education website, and you can type in CEID and UCL, and you'll get to know more about us. We are grateful that you are able to join us today. And without further ado, I would now want to hand over to Beatrice Szczepek to offer her welcome remarks. Over to you, Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses, and also from me, a very, very warm welcome on behalf of King's College London, where we have King's International Education Research Network, which is co-hosting the event today with our colleagues from the Institute of Education at UCL. So very warm welcome to this exciting opportunity to engage with UNESCO's Futures of Education report. We are honored to have with us one of the co-authors of the report, Arjun Appadurai, who is also obviously one of the members of the International Commission that UNESCO put together to write this report. Professor Appadurai is a true thought leader in the socio-cultural dynamics of globalization. He is Goddard Professor in Media, Culture and Communication at New York University, and in the past has held professorial chairs at Yale, at the University of Chicago, and the University of Pennsylvania. He is also holds and has held several honorary and visiting appointments, including at universities in Rotterdam, Mumbai, Göttingen, Paris, Delhi, Michigan, Amsterdam, Iowa, and Columbia University. In addition, he's served on several scholarly and advisory bodies in the United States, Latin America, Europe, and India. So a truly influential thinker that we have here today, and we so much look forward to what you have to say later on, Arjun. Once Professor Appadurai has completed his talk, we will hear from Professor Paul Morris. He's Professor of Comparative Education at UCL Institute of Education. And as our second panelist, Dr. Maren Elfert, she's lecturer in Education and Society here in the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London. Following those two contributions, we will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dr. Will Brehm. He's Associate Professor of International Development and Education at the Institute of Education. And then following that Q&A session, we will have our closing remarks, which will be made by Professor Li Wei, who is the director of the UCL Institute of Education. So now we very much look forward to Professor Appadurai's talk. Welcome to London, and thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Well, thank you all very much, and my apologies that between me and Zoom, I could not join you in spite of my incessant efforts for at least 10 or 12 minutes. Just sorry what to say. I'm very honored to be here and to be hosted by this combination of two distinguished London institutions, both of which I've known about and had links to of one or other kind for a longer time than some of you have lived. So it's very nice to be with you all virtually from Berlin, where I live now. So I want to launch in because I want to stick to the 20-minute limit and make the best of it. First of all, to say that I will share some thoughts of my own, but I'm mostly keen to be a voice for this report and for UNESCO in regard to this report, because it's their collective vision that created the conditions of work, collaboration, and discussion over almost 2 years, essentially the very difficult COVID period in which this report had to be produced. And so I want to congratulate the UNESCO staff and also the UNESCO leadership that opened the doors and guided the making of this. So it's a big endeavor, and I'm very honored to be a small part of it. That said, I recall that when this report, this commission was first put into place, the idea was to think hard and anew about the E in UNESCO. And that struck me as a very important thing, because for many of us who knew the work of UNESCO well over the years, it seemed that science and culture was certainly getting a lot of thought and a lot of programming, a lot of work, but that education, while certainly was a fruitful part of UNESCO, didn't seem to have the same massive global presence as a part of the UNESCO platform. And those of us who were not professionally, let's say, in education schools, may not have thought about this that hard. But as educators, we certainly were aware that UNESCO could play a bigger role. And so when this commission was formed and I was asked to serve on it, I was quick to accept, both because I've long been a supporter of UNESCO, but this was my first opportunity to reflect on the word and the pillar, the education pillar of UNESCO. So that's very important. This is an effort to reconceive that pillar in the UNESCO mission, along with its other aims. The second thing to say is I was very supportive of and intrigued by the use of the word futures, the plural, rather than future. This is a one-letter difference, but quite sizable from my point of view, because from my earlier scholarly years in the 1960s, many such endeavors issuing from Europe and the United States have tended to be consciously or otherwise been influenced by the, let's call it the modernization umbrella, which generally saw one future or one direction or one path or one teleology from societies, let's call them traditional societies or non-Western societies, or more bluntly, non-modern societies, to some kind of modernity. But the path was seen as more or less a single path. And often the destination was seen as a single destination. And I have to say, this point of view remains highly influential even today, when lots of people have moved to another way of thinking. And so it's highly commendable that UNESCO put in the S. And what the S implies to me, that is the pluralizing of the future, is that the future should also be a space of freedom, design and choice for the maximum number of people. That is to say, it should have as broad a range as possible, because the truth is that not everyone in every part of the world, not every country, every region, every class, every gender sees the destination for the path they're on to be the same. Now, obviously, this means there must be debate between these visions of the future, because we have to agree on means. And if we disagree on ends, of course, those have to be debated until we create enough consensus to create certain paths forward. So we need consensus, but assuming a uniform future for everyone is not the best way to go there. It also flies in the face of the great UNESCO ideals of diversity, plurality, and difference as valued and valuable principles of human growth, human development, and human flourishing. We take all these things for granted today, but to actually bring them into a report like this is no easy task. And we faced numerous challenges as people trying to write this report, but we were resting on the shoulders of a vast army of researchers who were trying to gather global opinion. So this was not a top-down, put 10 people in a room and come up with a report. It was based on constant feedback from teachers, from schools, from administrators, from students, from politicians, and numerous others on a truly worldwide basis. And that was an iterative process for this entire 2-year period. But I'll give you a quick look at 2 or 3 things that we struggled with, among many. This, by the way, is a report with almost no chaff or fluff in it. It's pure protein. It's pure muscle. 150 or 170 pages. That's a rare thing in massive, collectively produced multilateral documents. But this is a very serious piece of work. I'm sure of that. So the first dilemma was how to deal with the fact that we are living in an avalanche of information these days. That information is often called data, and that data is often called big. So when you use the words information, data, and big, it's the same complex of things, all of which are products of the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years. And one of our major challenges was, how do we advise students, teachers, policymakers, communities to cope with this avalanche of data? And one of the things I think the report contains is a lot of excellent, practical, actionable ideas about how to bring what we may call knowledge or insight or wisdom into discussions which are otherwise dominated by the question of amounts of data and scaling up amounts of data. And at best, in the digital world, there's a concession that big data is no better than the patterns we can find in it. But even patterns is a very specific way of organizing information. There are many other ways to think of structures, regularities, lessons, insights, which may not belong to patterns in the sense that you see a pattern on the screen or a pattern in a chart, etc. So we struggled quite a lot with this, and I can only say that all of us felt that it was very important to empower our students and our teachers at every level by giving them the feeling that they are not buried in data, but rather can steer what they want to know and how much they want to know and how they want to scale it and how they want to represent it, how they want to store it, archive it, disseminate it, that they are in the driver's seat. And if there are technologies and platforms and affordances that threaten that role, they should be resisted or modified or adjusted so that they leave humans as the forces that steer these things. So that's so far as information and data goes. Second, the broader question, the pros and cons of digitality itself. It was a very big theme throughout our discussions because, of course, it's inescapable today. And we examined the many tensions surrounding digitality, and we insisted that we would not fall into the Manichaean trap. Digitality contains all our solutions, or digitality is the source of all our problems. We took the difficult middle path that digitality is a huge source of our strengths, but it also needs to be reflected on ethically, politically, culturally, so that it is at the service of other ends over which we can have debates and through which we can build consensus. But digitality as such is an instrument, but it's so powerful an instrument that it constantly threatens to confuse the relationship between means and ends. And I think one great thing about this report, I'll say as an act of promotion on behalf of the work itself, is that it gives us a vision for dealing with the digital revolution intelligently, for taking what we need, and always remembering that there are people on the edges of the digital revolution, on the outside looking in, and we can never forget them because they're a very large part of the population. We used to use terms like digital divide and so on. So now maybe divide is not the best term, but we know there are people who are not full beneficiaries, and we can't leave them out of account and behave as if our highest end affordances are available to everyone. So that was a big set of discussions. Finally, and it's connected to the issue of information, data, and digitality. I think, now this is my opinion and my observation, it's not in the report, but it's one of the things I found very richly provoked by the report, and that is how to think of the futures of education, which is the big theme of the report, in a manner in which we can resolve what looks like a unresolvable contradiction in our lives, in knowledge, in education, in teaching, in pedagogy, between quantity and quality. Either we have more or we have better, so it seems. So the only way to have better is by having fewer people or fewer this or that. In other words, privilege. So my personal view is that to resolve the tension between quality and quantity in terms of our knowledge, data, information, our pedagogy, and so on, the only path is by taking education very seriously as a medium in which knowledge is simultaneously discovered anew and transmitted again. So education is that place where the effort to transmit what we know sparks new knowledge. And that's the place where we can resolve, I think, and I have to leave it very brief, stop now, this deep battle between more and better, which seems to be bedeviling us in so many parts of our lives. I'll stop there with many thanks, and I look forward to hearing the responses of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and especially thank you for keeping to time. This report maintains a strong humanitarian orientation long associated with UNESCO's visions of education. Overall, I interpret it as a response to both the powerful impact of the tenets of neoliberalism on education and to a range of factors that have emerged or accelerated over the last 3 decades, including climate change, technological change, the digital age, sustainability, and health pandemics. In parallel, the report also promotes forms of education designed to alleviate past injustices. The report thus offers a promissory narrative which provides a refreshing and very welcome alternative to neoliberalism and its handmaiden human capital theory, which has dominated discussions of education policy globally for many decades. It was refreshing to read a report which adopts a vocabulary which relates to human dignity, cooperation, inclusion, and community, This is in marked contrast to the recent deluge of publications from international agencies and the global education industry, which under the mantra of Build Back Better, imagined a new and transformed form of post-pandemic education. Their core feature was to harness the crisis as an opportunity to promote a form of digital or platform capitalism characterized by a reliance on big data, artificial intelligence, neuroscience and technology, a diminished role for the public sector in ensuring greater access to more equitable education, and changing the role of teachers or replacing them by new technologies. The report provides a powerful and welcome alternative to those recent neoliberal visions of the future. Whilst the report stresses its desire to initiate discussions about possible futures of education, rather than make definitive recommendations, its desired direction of travel is clear, namely to work together to create a new social contract for education, which ensures peaceful, just and sustainable futures and rights past wrongs. The proposals to achieve this are drawn from a broadly liberal progressive view of the nature and role of education, which includes a focus on child-centered pedagogies, on communities and cooperation, the promotion of empathy and compassion, a concern for the current reliance on comparative metrics and big data, a recognition of the role and value of teachers, and a cautious view of the benefits of technology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. This is a visionary, optimistic, and idealized vision of the future. While strongly supporting the overall direction, I am, however, less optimistic that the report will challenge the status quo and its dominant narrative, or that communities around the world will respond to the quest to initiate conversations designed to create a new contract for education. As T.S. Eliot wrote, between the idea and the reality falls a long shadow. My concern is that the shadow cast by this report is so deep and long that it will fail to emerge from it. Whilst it will appeal to the converted, it will easily be ignored by those in power. Further, that gap between the vision and reality is deepened by the report's tendency to look through an idealistic lens at present realities. That lens also serves to filter out consideration of how power and politics shape education, and minimum consideration of how to achieve the desired changes. The avoidance of politics is evident in its core idea as to how to initiate change, namely for communities to begin a process of discussion that will create a new social contract for education. This is based on the assumption that, and I quote, education can be seen in terms of a social contract, an implicit agreement among members of a society to cooperate for shared benefit. This depiction of how education is shaped may be true in some progressive liberal democracies, but it sidesteps consideration of the role of power in shaping education and ignores the potential use of education to indoctrinate and sow division. These factors are briefly and obliquely recognized in the introductory chapter, but essentially only provide the rationale for reform and do not feature subsequently in the analysis or consideration of how it will be achieved. In the authoritarian states in which the majority of humanity live, it is difficult to see how education is a product of such a social contract, nor how the desired co-construction of a new social contract will be initiated in these nations. For example, I doubt whether the non-Hindu minorities in India or the Uyghurs in China would view the education they received as the product of a social contract intended to ensure shared benefits. The report's avoidance of power and politics facilitates its belief that the primary means through which society can be changed for the better is through education. As the report states, to shape the futures we want, education itself must be transformed. In effect, schools or education is held primarily responsible for what goes on outside the school gates. To paraphrase Basil Bernstein, education cannot, on its own, compensate for society. Whilst education has provided social mobility and opportunity for many, it has not done so in a manner that reflects the priorities and it has not done so in a manner that reflects the prejudices. It has done so in a manner which reflects the priorities and prejudice of the elites in power. By positioning education as a solution, the report allows those in power to ignore the deep-rooted social and economic problems which are mirrored but not caused by education systems. A key question is, will this report succeed in providing a narrative which challenges that which currently prevails? And will those in power respond to the report and begin to rethink the nature and purposes of education? Hans Becker argues that the neoliberal narrative has dominated all aspects of public policy since the early 1990s, despite it having failed to deliver on its promises. He attributes this to its malleability and the failure to successfully develop an alternative narrative. For three reasons, I do not see this report as providing such an alternative narrative. Firstly, it provides a vision which is easily portrayed as utopian and ignored. Secondly, the report's humanist vision is being appropriated by the main advocates of neoliberalism, such as the OECD, who are repackaging their narrative with the humanitarian wrapping. Thirdly, UNESCO's prior record is not encouraging. Its previous reports failed to abate the emergence of the very education systems which this report now seeks to change. Thank you.
I think I will take over from here straight away. So I would like to thank Arjun Appadurai and Paul Morris for their remarks. I'm humbled to share space with you and all of those present in this call. And I think it's wonderful, Professor Appadurai, that you have participated in the UNESCO Commission. And I hope you will forgive me if I make some critical remarks about the report, which resemble some of Paul's remarks. So let me state by reiterating what Paul said, that it was refreshing to read a report that focuses on humanistic perspectives. In good old UNESCO tradition, this report represents a very welcome counter voice to the corporate reform language that usually frames educational policy debates these days. In my short contribution, I will focus on relating the Futures of Education report to the two previous UNESCO reports on the future of education, the 1972 FOR report and the 1996 Delors report. The Futures of Education report denotes a clear shift from the previous reports, as its key message is no longer on lifelong learning. Both the FOR and Delors reports postulated lifelong learning as the global educational master concept that stood for a democratization of society. The Futures of Education report mentions lifelong learning several times, but does not engage substantially with the concept. Despite this difference, the Futures of Education report also has similarities with the previous reports. It connects with them by designing an ideal vision of a just society. It connects with the FOR report by making the social contract one of its key ideas. And it connects with the Delors report by placing the emphasis on the collective, togetherness, and the interdependencies with one another. The global common good is another key idea. It also connects with the previous reports by reclaiming education as a right and the notion of humanism. However, it is a different form of humanism. Both the FOR and Delors reports were situated in UNESCO's Enlightenment tradition, in that they were indebted to rationalism and progress, universal values, and a concept of human beings as masters of their own destiny. The Futures of Education report reframes humanism towards a more planetary, less anthropocentric, and decolonized humanism. This shift can also be seen by the fact that the Faure and Delors commissions were both chaired by French male politicians, Edgar Faure and Jacques Delors, very much rooted intellectually in the Western Enlightenment tradition, while the new report was chaired by a woman from Africa, also a politician, Sahle-Work Zewde, the president of Ethiopia. The shifts between these reports indicate the changing dilemmas they were responding to. The Faure report responded to the 1968 student revolts in France and civil rights movements around the world. It challenged the economistic human capital approach to education that had gained ground during the 1960s. The Delors report responded to the rise of neoliberalism and the downsides of globalization. The new Futures of Education report is responding to our recognition of the damage we have done to the planet, to other living beings, and to ourselves. The report exudes a sense of urgency, that we need a new beginning, that we need to radically change course. This urgency was also very much felt in the Faure report of 1972, which called for democracy as a social and political system. The Faure report also focused on the social contract, which was related to the context of the Keynesian democratic welfare state, the dominant economic model at the time, as a way of controlling capitalism and spending the surplus produced by capitalism to the benefit of those in need. The idea of the social contract was also related to the 1960s, 1970s human rights movement, in which not states, but everyone, everywhere became the subjects of a vision of global justice. Also, the Delors report portrayed democracy as the only possible political system that allows for a balance between individual freedom and social cohesion, and was concerned about a crisis of democracy. The new report makes critical remarks about the backsliding of democracy, but it does not assign the same urgency to democracy as the Faure report did. It takes up Faure's concept of the social contract, but does not define it very well. The Futures of Education report is aspirational, as the previous reports were, but much less political. It describes a utopia that is not grounded in reality. Paulo Freire reminded us that education for freedom requires critical knowledge of the real. Dreaming was very important to Freire, but it had to be based on a critical analysis. Freire wrote, "Utopia is an act of knowing critically. I cannot denounce an oppressing structure if I do not penetrate into it and know it." This report, it seems to me, lacks an analysis of the structural obstacles to the implementation of the ideas it presents. In particular, it lacks an analysis of power. It represents what Foucault, in his essay on Other Spaces, describes as a placeless space, a utopia, a site with no real place. How can we bring about radical changes if we don't address power and the relationship between power and knowledge, if we don't talk about the corporatization of education, for example, or analyze it, rather? The report presents us with a beautiful vision of how we should be living on this planet, but without any analysis of how we can overcome the structural obstacles towards that vision. Paul pointed out that UNESCO's prior record is not encouraging. And it's true that the policy influence of the Faure and Delors reports was very limited, as the more instrumentalist human capital approach to education won the day. Professor Appadurai has written about the ethics of probability based on numbers, statistics, and tools that can be managed and controlled, and the ethics of possibility, visions, imagination, aspirational thinking. UNESCO's ideas, such as lifelong learning, spread around the world, but were appropriated by other actors, deprived of its political message, and co-opted by the ethics of probability. Ideas such as the common good and the social contract have just as much potential to be co-opted by other agendas. The lack of policy influence and the fact that its ideas have been co-opted is not only UNESCO's fault. Since its inception, UNESCO's authority has been challenged and the organization has been outmaneuvered by competing organizations, such as the World Bank and the OECD, that had different mandates and worldviews than UNESCO and gained greater capital and legitimacy. Is it a wonder that this report avoids political statements, given that UNESCO has been attacked for decades and deprived of funding for being a politicized organization? It is therefore, in my view, important that we use the opportunity of this report for a discussion about the global governance landscape of education, how it has changed since UNESCO was created, and how we want it to change, or do we want it in the first place? This discussion cannot be had without addressing power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Maren and Arjun. That was very nice to hear all three. To start the conversation, the question and answer conversation, we have about 10 minutes. I actually thought perhaps we could turn it over to Arjun to perhaps respond a bit to Paul and Maren's critique, particularly around this issue of power. And, you know, is the report sidestepping power in a way? And how, Arjun, do you see issues of power and politics coming out in the report, in the production of the report, perhaps? You'll have to unmute, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I'm grateful to Paul and to Maren, because of course, I'm not, actually an employee of UNESCO, so I have a full and independent life and have many of my own external worries. And so actually I share many of your concerns about the built-in limits, default limits, as well as the limits of omission. And I won't go into each of them in detail, but I'm generally quite sympathetic to what you say. But I do want to react perhaps in a devil's advocate way to give perhaps you and people who ask this set of questions also some pause. The first is, can UNESCO or even the UN system be expected to solve the problem of the worldwide domination of capital in every respect of our lives? Neoliberalism is a short word for saying capitalism is everywhere. Is it fair to charge UNESCO with the solution of that problem when every left party, starting in London and ending up in Latin America and India, has failed scandalously to capture the imaginations of the electorate and the masses in all their countries, so that we have a global swing to the right? I mean, where should we lay that problem? I mean, and once we figure out how to analyze that problem and whose failures we should point to, starting with ourselves on the left, who have totally lost the battleground to the right in politics at large, before we come to the question, what should UNESCO do or not do? So I urge a more equitable discussion of our failure on the left over 50 years to combat all the processes that Paul and Maren have talked about. Number two, power. I quite agree. And the single 800-pound gorilla on the page of UNESCO, but on all our pages, which nobody here has addressed, is there's no point of discussing power, politics, or any of the related words without talking of the architecture of the nation state. UNESCO responds to the system of nation states. What's effective, what's sayable, what's unsayable, what's doable, what will work. Everything depends on those national delegations and their ambassadors who foot the bill and do all the actual practical work. And they are in a design which is precisely neither global, nor planetary, nor human. It has to do with the thing we call the nation state. So I have a location myself for where the problem lies. And it's not only UNESCO's problem. It's the problem of everybody. And the only people who have solved it are the global corporations who figured out how to make the nation state work for them from location to location. Everybody else is simply inside the prison house of thinking nationally. So that's my understanding of where the power discussion ought to be. And it's a very hard thing to discuss when everybody you're going to speak to, everybody is supporting your effort, belongs officially to national delegations. This is the UNESCO dilemma, in my view, not so much its failures of omission, commission, intelligence, attention, information. They're all there, but the structure is forbidding. So let me just leave it there, that that's the reason why even the interesting ideas here, and I appreciate the comparison to the previous report, such as the question of the common good, the social contract. I must confess that it's a long time since I've been in a discussion where the question of the social contract is brought up for discussion, as it were, from the basics. Normally, it's confined to sociology 100 and political science 102. Who talks about the social contract? So I'm happy that we even have a little discussion of that, but that's a half full, half empty kind of comment. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
To build on that issue of the social contract, I mean, I think there's been quite a few questions that have come up both in the chat and in the Q&A about the social contract, and potentially it being both an old concept, and I think that's what you're hinting at, Arjun, about that it's only potentially talked in a few courses these days, but it's also a rather Western concept. And the report might emphasize things like local knowledge, but by emphasizing the social contract, it's sort of reiterating this rather old way of thinking, which, does that end up, going against some of this revolutionary ideas that are potentially included in the report? And I'll just add as well that it's quite interesting that this report came out almost the same time that David Graeber and David Wengrow's new book, The Dawn of Everything, came out, which basically, completely critiques the idea of the social contract from Hobbes. So, it's just, how do we make sense of this social contract? I know you were just ending on it. Is the report actually saying something revolutionary with old words, or are we just going back to old ideas here?
Well, I'll just respond very quickly, and perhaps my colleagues want to add to this. I don't think there's anything revolutionary except to reopen that concept of fresh discussion. That's the new part. The embarrassing fact is that outside of Europe, it's very difficult to find cognate concepts. You can find other concepts of all sorts. But you see what we've talked about today, Freire, Marx, the address is all within the same zip code, So nothing is coming out from somewhere else. There are people talking from the indigenous world in Latin America here, there, but they don't give us easy translations into our contemporary institutional reality. So Walter Mignolo, great student of indigenous thought and decoloniality, doesn't give you a bridge to our world as it is today. So it is not easy, in my considered view, as an anthropologist and as a scholar of India, among other things, to point to alternative designs for thinking, which are different from, superior to, and with more traction on reality than, let's say, things like the social contract. So until that is true, we have to work with what we have, even if it's creaky stuff,
Paul or Maren, I'd like to bring you in if you'd like to respond to anything that Arjun has said about power and politics and social contracts.
Yeah, should I start, Will?
Sure, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot to say. As I said, in the Fore report in the early 1970s, the social contract was about two things. There was, first in the 1960s and 70s, there was this cosmopolitan vision of global justice. There were lots of new, NGOs, Amnesty International, human rights organizations that mushroomed. That was one thing. That was the zeitgeist at the time. And then there was also this aspect of controlling capitalism, keeping capitalism in check and making sure that the less privileged would benefit from the profits made by capitalism. And then the Delors report did not say so much about the social contract, actually. It didn't write much about the state either, because it's such a controversial issue. And I think it would have been helpful if the Futures of Education report had been more specific about what the social contract means. And because what we currently have really in terms of the social contract, or rather non-contract, is the responsibility of learners and workers to equip themselves with the skills that make them employable and marketable. And in this logic, the state or the government assumes no responsibility anymore for the education of its citizens. And this is ultimately a worldview that's incompatible with the notion of the social contract, which underpinned very much the Fore report, you know, which put forward this idea of lifelong learning, which was also a social contract. And I also think with regard to the role of the nation states, I think Arjun is absolutely right that this is this has always been a problem in UNESCO, and why it's also so politicized because of the nation state, all of the different interests of the nation states. But I would argue that today we're shifting towards global governance and multi-stakeholderism very much, where also even in the UN system, there's increasing influence of philanthropic foundations, corporations, multi-stakeholder groups, and it's becoming increasingly intransparent, actually, who is in charge and what is going on. That are just a few thoughts.
And Paul?
Just on the question of power, I take Arjun's point that it's essentially impossible within UNESCO to directly address questions of power that relate to nation states and national systems of governance. I take Maren's point, there is an emerging sources of power in international agencies, in multinational corporations that effectively operate outside nation states. But I think given how difficult it is for UNESCO or any UNESCO document to address questions of power and politics directly, all the more important it is for people outside that system to add that perspective. All right, yes. I appreciate the reasons why it's so difficult to get into a document, but I think it's extremely important that those who are able to point out that omission do so.
Thank you, Paul and Maren. I'd like to, another issue that has come up, and this will unfortunately have to be the last one given the time limits here, is about, what are the expected impacts that this report may have on people on the ground? And another way of phrasing that, what is the official status of this report in UNESCO policy? Is this report going to actually make change at both the sort of UNESCO level and what it does, as well as what, potentially you hope, Arjun, may happen inside, schools, inside people's homes, how we think about education? What impact would you like to actually see this report have?
So this is my take alone, and it actually connects to Paul's last comment, which I thoroughly endorse, namely that the report is not meant to close something off, it's meant to add to the armory of tools we have as citizens, as actors, as activists, and so on, in our respective societies, meant to add something to that effort, which is certainly well outside the walls of UNESCO or even the UN system as a whole. So in that spirit, I think this report is in a way wisely strategic about its goal, which is to broadcast itself as a set of ideas, values, possibilities, as well as solutions, because there's a lot of very concrete stuff in the report, which is not just saying, well, let's have a new social contract. It's highly detailed about curricula, about this and that. It should not be forgotten. But that all of those are underwritten by the idea that this report will be disseminated as widely as the surveys and reports and reactions that were collected worldwide from all kinds of interest groups and associations and constituencies as humanly possible in a 2-year period. The idea is to send it out again. So this is indeed a particular kind of message in a bottle, except that the targets are known, which is people with any stakes who can then say what they like or don't like, put pressure where they wish to or can or feel safe it is to do. So the idea is maximum dissemination as an a la carte set of possibilities, not as a doctrine that you have to buy this way or that. That's my view of what the hope for impact is, that it strengthens the actual diversity of actors, interests, and concerns on a worldwide basis. That's why events like this, in the hope that 50 more people, 100 more people may see something, look at the report, get an idea, try it out. That I see as the experimental sort of Heisenbergian disturbance model, as opposed to a kind of, here's our view, take it or leave it, which some reports can have.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Arjun, for joining us, for Paul and Maren for being the discussant. And I want to turn it over to Professor Li Wei to give some closing remarks for today's event.
Thank you and good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is such a wonderful event, marking the publication of an important and, of course, provocative UNESCO report, which is billed as a global initiative to reimagine how knowledge and learning can shape the future of humanity and the planet, at a time when such reimagination is critically needed. It is such a privilege to hear Professor Appadurai's keynote and the discussion, really fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time that followed. Most of us here, if not all, are concerned with education and the role of education in the reimagining and reshaping of the future of humanity and the planet. The UCL Institute of Education is founded more than 119 years ago on the values of equity and social justice. We believe that education will not only help to strengthen our futures as a species, but also to make those futures more just, more full, and more peaceful by transforming lives and society. And to do so, we need a genuinely decolonizing attitude and method. The pandemic has revealed more inequalities and injustices in today's world than perhaps many of us had realized. The new variants, I'm sure there will be more, so it's plural, need global collective efforts to manage. Similarly, climate change also needs to be tackled through collaboration on a global scale and through education in order to achieve climate justice. The Center for Education and International Development at the IOE, one of our oldest research centers in the UCL Institute of Education, is at the forefront of our work in decolonizing education. I really want to thank all my colleagues and colleagues at King's and everyone who's contributed to organizing today's event, and of course, to our very distinguished speaker, Professor Appadurai, for the thought-provoking discussion today. I'm going to now pass to my colleague, Professor Oketch, for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Li Wei. Li Wei is my boss as the director of the Institute of Education. After he has spoken, actually, I should not say anything else. So I just want to say thank you all, and to our keynote speaker, Professor Appadurai, for those insights, and also to Paul, Professor Paul Morrison, and to Dr. Maren Elfert, and also to my colleague, Beatrice Szczepek, who co-hosted this with me. Thank you all, and goodbye now.